The grand drawing room fell dead silent as the Dowager Duchess's voice cut through the crystal-clinking elegance like a serrated blade. "Do not flatter yourself, my dear." She sneered, her icy gaze raking over her new daughter-in-law's trembling frame. "You were bought, not chosen. A crude transaction to repair our roof, nothing more." Leora's heart shattered as she braced for the aristocratic crowd's cruel laughter. But then, a deep, commanding voice echoed from the arched doorway. "You are mistaken, mother. I chose her." The ink on the marriage contract had barely dried before the whispers began to snake through the opulent ballrooms of Mayfair. Leora Hastings, the sole heir to the Hastings Railway fortune, was to become the next Duchess of Somerset. To the untrained eye, it was a fairy tale. To the wolves of London high society, it was a tragedy written in pounds and pence. Thomas Hastings. Leora's father was a man carved from coal and iron. He had clawed his way up from the soot-choked streets of Birmingham to become one of the wealthiest industrialists in the British Empire. But wealth, as Thomas quickly learned, could not buy pedigree. It could not buy invitations to the royal enclosures at Ascot, and it certainly could not erase the invisible stain of new money that clung to his bespoke suits. So he decided to buy the one thing that could, a dukedom for his only daughter. Enter Gabriel Pendleton, the 9th Duke of Somerset. At 28, Gabriel was a man drowning in a sea of inherited sins. His late father, a man of legendary charm and catastrophic vices, had gambled away the Somerset fortune on French thoroughbreds and reckless investments in South American silver mines. When Gabriel inherited the title, he also inherited a crumbling estate tenant farmers on the brink of starvation, and a mountain of debt that threatened to swallow his family's 600-year legacy whole. The arrangement was brokered in a dim, mahogany-panelled solicitor's office on Chancery Lane. It was a sterile, bloodless affair. Leora sat perfectly still in her high-collared silk gown, her hands folded in her lap, listening as her future, her body and her name were bartered for exactly £150,000. When Gabriel had walked into the room that day, Leora's breath had caught in her throat. He was devastatingly handsome, with sharp aristocratic features, dark hair swept neatly back, and eyes the colour of a winter sea. But those eyes were hollow. He looked at her, not with the warmth of a prospective husband, but with the weary resignation of a soldier walking toward a firing squad. He signed his name with a swift, aggressive stroke of the pen, bowed stiffly to her father, and left without speaking a single word to his bride. Their wedding day at St. George's, Hanover Square, was a spectacle of staggering hypocrisy. 300 guests crowded the pews. Lord Reginald Fife, a notoriously loose-lipped baron, leaned over to Lady Agatha Danvers in the second row, whispering behind a white-gloved hand. "They say Hastings paid in solid gold bars. Pity the Duke couldn't afford a bride with actual blood in her veins instead of coal dust." Leora heard the whispers. She felt the condescending stares burning into her back as she walked down the aisle in a gown of Brussels lace that cost more than most men made in a lifetime. She looked toward the altar, praying for a sign of comfort from the man she was about to bind her soul to. But Gabriel stood like a statue carved from granite. When he took her hand to slide the heavy ancient Somerset family ring onto her finger, his skin was ice cold. "I, Gabriel William Pendleton, take thee, Leora." His voice was a low, resonant rumble echoing off the vaulted stone ceilings, yet completely devoid of emotion. The carriage ride to their London townhouse was suffocating. The silence between them was thick enough to choke on. Leora, desperate to bridge the chasm, finally gathered the courage to speak. "The ceremony was beautiful, Your Grace." She offered her voice barely above a whisper. Gabriel did not even turn his head from the window. "It was efficient, madam. Let us not romanticize a business transaction. You have your coronet, and my estates have their salvation. We need not pretend this is anything else." The words struck her like a physical blow. Leora turned away, blinking back the hot tears that threatened to ruin her makeup. She had known logically that this was an arranged marriage, but a small, foolish part of her had hoped that perhaps given time they could find friendship, perhaps even affection. In that single brutal carriage ride, Gabriel had crushed that hope into dust. What Leora did not know, what she could not see behind his rigid jawline, was the agonizing shame burning inside the Duke. He hated himself for selling his title. He hated that he was using this beautiful, innocent young woman's inheritance to pay for his father's sins. And most of all, he hated that every time he looked at her, he was reminded of his own utter failure to save his family on his own terms. To survive the guilt, Gabriel did the only thing he knew how to do. He built a fortress of ice around his heart, ensuring Leora could never breach it. The true nightmare began when the newlyweds left London for Oakhaven, the sprawling centuries-old ducal seat in the sprawling countryside of Yorkshire. Oakhaven was a monolith of grey stone, brooding and magnificent, surrounded by thousands of acres of ancient forests and rolling moors. It was here that Leora was introduced to her true warden, Rachel Pendleton, the Dowager Duchess of Somerset. Rachel was a woman who commanded fear as effortlessly as she drew breath. Draped in perpetual mourning black, despite her husband having been dead for 4 years, she looked like a venomous spider reigning over a vast web. She was a daughter of an earl, a cousin to a duke, and she viewed Leora's arrival not as a salvation, but as an unforgivable desecration of her bloodline. On Leora's first morning at Oakhaven, she descended the grand staircase determined to take on her role as the new Duchess. By tradition, the heavy ring of keys to the estate symbolizing control over the household, the staff and the pantries should have been handed over to her upon arrival. She found Rachel in the morning room sipping Earl Grey tea from a delicate bone china cup. "Good morning, Your Grace," Leora said politely, her hands folded neatly in front of her. "I was hoping we might go over the household accounts today. I understand there is much to be done, and I wish to assume my duties." Rachel slowly lowered her teacup. Her eyes, a paler, colder version of Gabriel's, fixed on Leora with unvarnished disgust. "Your duties, Mrs. Pendleton." She emphasized the common prefix, blatantly refusing to use Leora's new title. "Your duties are to sit quietly, embroider cushions, and provide my son with an heir. The management of Oakhaven is a task for a true gentlewoman. It requires refinement, history, and an understanding of our people. It is not a railway station to be managed with a heavy common hand." "I am the Duchess of Somerset," Leora replied, her voice trembling but resolute. "The keys belong to me." Rachel stood up, towering over the younger woman. "You hold the title only because your father's vulgar money bought it. Do not mistake a legal document for a sudden elevation in your breeding. The staff answers to me. The accounts remain with me. You are a guest here, Leora. A well-paying guest, but a guest nonetheless." Leora sought out Gabriel that evening to intervene, finding him in his vast, shadowy study, buried under a mountain of ledgers and architectural plans. He looked exhausted, the dark circles under his eyes standing out starkly against his pale skin. "Gabriel!" She began, softly stepping into the room. He didn't look up from his papers. "I am busy, Leora. The roof on the west wing is rotting and the tenant cottages in the lower valley need complete rebuilding before winter. It is about your mother." She pressed, stepping closer to his desk. "She refuses to yield the household keys. She has explicitly instructed Mrs. Higgins and the staff to ignore my orders. I cannot live as a prisoner in my own home." Gabriel finally sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose in deep irritation. "My mother is a proud woman who has lost everything, including her pride, to keep this estate afloat. She is set in her ways. Do not provoke her, Leora. Let her keep her keys. Is your life here so terrible that you must wage war over a ring of iron? It is about respect, Gabriel," Leora pleaded. "Respect is earned." He snapped, finally looking at her, his eyes flashing with a sudden, overwhelming frustration. "My mother has given her blood and youth to this estate. You simply wrote a check. Please. I have 500 lives depending on these crop rotations. Let her manage the house so I can manage our survival. Close the door on your way out." Dismissed. Discarded. Leora retreated to her separate chambers in the east wing, feeling the cold walls of Oakhaven closing in around her. Over the next 3 months, the psychological warfare waged by Rachel escalated. The Dowager Duchess was a master of subtle cruelty. When Leora requested the carriage to visit the village, she was told the horses were resting. When Leora ordered specific flowers for the dining room, they were mysteriously replaced with Rachel's preferred orchids. At dinners, Rachel would intentionally steer the conversation toward intricate family genealogies of the aristocracy, leaving Leora to sit in humiliating silence, while Gabriel ate quickly and retreated back to his work. But Leora was Thomas Hastings' daughter. She was not a wilting violet to be crushed under the heel of a bitter old woman. Denied access to the household management, Leora began to explore the library. She found decades of neglected estate ledgers, agricultural reports and financial records tucked away in dusty corners. In the dead of night, by the flickering light of a single candle, Leora began to read. She applied the sharp, analytical mind her father had cultivated in her. She saw the gross mismanagement, the archaic farming techniques, the middlemen who were swindling the Duke out of his rightful profits. Gabriel was working himself to death, trying to patch holes in a sinking ship, but he was too bound by tradition to see that the entire hull needed replacing. She began to quietly draft a comprehensive proposal. A way to modernize the mills, build a small rail spur, to transport the estate's timber directly to the main lines and restructure the tenant contracts to increase yield while lowering the farmers' burdens. It was brilliant. It was her way of proving her worth not just as a checkbook, but as a true partner to Gabriel. She just needed the right moment to show him. Unfortunately, her mother-in-law had plans of her own to ensure Leora never found a voice. The height of the social season had traditionally always been marked by the Dowager Duchess's exclusive afternoon tea at Oakhaven. It was a gathering of the most elite ancient families in the country. For Rachel, it was the perfect stage to assert her continued dominance over high society and to publicly put her new, common daughter-in-law in her place. The morning of the tea, Rachel's personal maid approached Leora's chambers. "The Dowager Duchess sends her compliments, Your Grace, and suggests you wear the simple lavender day dress for the gathering. She feels it would be most appropriate for your station today." Leora, wanting to keep the peace and avoid another scolding from Gabriel, complied. She donned the plain, modest lavender gown, devoid of heavy jewels or intricate lacework. When Leora descended into the grand drawing room, her heart plummeted into her stomach. The room was a sea of glittering jewels, heavy French silks and magnificent plumed hats. Lady Genevieve of Cornwall, the Countess of Grantham, and the Duchess of Marlborough were all draped in their finest, most opulent afternoon couture. By dressing in the simple lavender cotton, Leora looked exactly like what Rachel wanted her to look like, a jumped-up governess, a servant who had wandered into the wrong room. Rachel stood at the center of the room, resplendent in heavy black silk and diamonds, holding court. When she saw Leora, a cruel, triumphant smile played on her lips. "Ah, Leora!" Rachel called out, her voice carrying effortlessly over the string quartet playing in the corner. "Do come in. I was just telling Lady Genevieve about your unique background." Leora kept her chin high despite the burning flush creeping up her neck. She walked gracefully into the room, taking a seat on a velvet settee. "Good afternoon, ladies," she greeted evenly. The older women stared at her with polite, thinly veiled contempt. "The Dowager was just regaling us with the tale of your father's iron works," Lady Genevieve said, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "Fascinating, really. All that fire and soot. Tell me, Mrs. Pendleton, do you find the air at Oakhaven a bit too clean for your liking?" A smattering of polite, cruel laughter rippled through the room. Leora folded her hands to stop them from shaking. "My father built a railway empire, Lady Genevieve. It connects this great nation. I am incredibly proud of the soot on his hands, for it built the modern world we all enjoy." Rachel scoffed loudly, setting her teacup down with a sharp clink. "The modern world is so terribly loud and vulgar. Don't you agree, ladies? We prefer the quiet dignity of breeding. But I suppose one cannot expect a cart horse to understand the bloodline of a thoroughbred." The insult was so direct, so breathtakingly rude, that even a few of the hardened aristocrats in the room exchanged wide-eyed glances. Leora's temper, usually kept tightly in check, flared. She looked directly at her mother-in-law. "A thoroughbred may have the bloodline, Your Grace, but when the stable is collapsing and the master is starving, it is the cart horse that pulls the plough and saves the farm." The room went deathly silent. The string quartet seemed to falter. Rachel's face contorted with pure, unadulterated fury. She stood up, no longer caring about the facade of polite society. She advanced on Leora, her voice trembling with venom. How dare you speak to me of saving this farm? Rachel hissed, her voice echoing in the vast, silent room. You are nothing but a common tradesman's daughter parading around in stolen finery. You think because your father's dirty money paid off our creditors that you are one of us. You will never be one of us. I am the Duchess of Somerset. Leora stated, her voice shaking, though she refused to break eye contact. I am your son's wife. It was then that Rachel delivered the killing blow, her voice ringing out like a judge pronouncing a death sentence. Do not flatter yourself, my dear. You were bought, not chosen. A crude transaction to repair our roof, nothing more. My son despises the very sight of you. You are a necessary humiliation, a heavy sack of gold we were forced to swallow. Nothing more. Leora felt the breath leave her lungs. The words hit her with the force of a speeding train. The absolute certainty in Rachel's voice stripped away every defense Leora had built. Tears pricked her eyes, and she felt the crushing weight of the room's stairs waiting for her to break, waiting for the commoner to run away crying. She lowered her head, preparing to stand and flee the room, accepting her utter defeat. You are mistaken, mother. The voice was like rolling thunder. Deep, resonant, and vibrating with a lethal, barely contained rage. Every head in the drawing room snapped toward the arched doorway. Gabriel Pendleton stood there. He was still in his riding boots, his dark coat dusted with the dirt of the fields, a riding crop gripped so tightly in his leather-gloved hand that the leather groaned. His chest heaved as he stared at his mother, his winter-sea eyes blazing with a terrifying fire. He strode into the room, his heavy boots echoing like gunshots against the parquet floor. He did not look at the Countess, he did not acknowledge the Duchess of Marlborough. He walked straight to the velvet settee, where Leora sat trembling. To the absolute shock of the entire room, Gabriel dropped to one knee right in front of his wife. He reached out with both hands and gently took Leora's trembling hands in his own. "Look at me, Leora!" He commanded, his voice suddenly dropping to a rough, desperate whisper, meant only for her, though the silent room heard every word. Leora raised her tear-filled eyes, expecting to see his usual coldness. Instead, she saw raw agony and fierce, undeniable protection. Gabriel stood up, keeping Leora's hand firmly locked in his, and turned to face his mother. The Dowager Duchess looked genuinely unnerved for the first time in her life. "Gabriel, you are interrupting," Rachel began. "I said you are mistaken." Gabriel interrupted, his voice echoing off the walls, laced with an authority that brooked no defiance. "The money saved the estate, yes, but I could have married the daughter of a Russian Tsar or an American banking heiress. I had offers, mother. Dozens of them." He squeezed Leora's hand, stepping slightly in front of her, shielding her from the room. "I chose Leora," the Duke declared, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "I chose her because of her strength, because of her father's brilliant mind, which I see reflected in her every day. I chose her because she is the only thing in this dying, rotting world that possesses actual life." Gabriel's gaze swept over the horrified faces of the gathered aristocrats, challenging any one of them to speak. None dared. He finally settled his blazing eyes back on his mother. "If you ever speak to my wife, your Duchess, with such profound disrespect again, you will find yourself managing the accounts of a very small, very distant cottage in the Scottish Highlands. Are we perfectly understood, mother?" Rachel opened her mouth, her face pale as a ghost, but no words came out. She gave a stiff, jerky nod. Gabriel turned back to Leora. The cold, unfeeling statue she had married was gone. In his place stood a man, violently awakened. "Come with me, my Grace," Gabriel said softly, offering her his arm. "This room is far too stifling for you." Leora placed her trembling hand on his strong arm, and together they turned their backs on the elite of London society, leaving the drawing room in absolute stunned silence. As they walked down the grand corridor, Leora's heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The transaction was over. The marriage, it seemed, had just begun. The heavy oak doors of Gabriel's private study slammed shut, severing them from the venomous whispers of the drawing room. For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of the hearth fire and Gabriel's ragged breathing. He released Leora's arm and stepped back, running a trembling hand through his perfectly groomed hair, destroying its aristocratic neatness. Leora stood by the mahogany desk, her heart still hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She watched her husband, the man who had barely looked at her for 3 months, pace the length of the Persian rug like a caged panther. "I should have stepped in sooner," Gabriel finally said, his voice raw, stripped of its usual icy reserve. He stopped and looked at her, his winter sea eyes dark with remorse. "I allowed my mother's bitterness to fester. I allowed her to treat you like a trespasser in your own home. For that, Leora, I am deeply, profoundly sorry." Leora swallowed hard, her fingers tracing the edge of the leather-bound ledger on his desk. "Why did you defend me today, Gabriel? After months of silence, after telling me in the carriage that this was nothing but a business transaction. Why now?" Gabriel moved closer, the scent of rain leather and horses clinging to his coat. He looked down at her, the walls he had built around himself crumbling into dust. "Because my silence was never about you, Leora. It was about my own cowardice." He gestured to the mountains of paperwork burying his desk. The overdue promissory notes, the threatening letters from London banks, the architectural surveys of rotting roofs. "My father, the great 8th Duke, spent his final years at the baccarat tables in Monte Carlo with Lord Richard Fitzroy and his ilk. He gambled away our liquid assets, then he mortgaged the lands, and finally he leveraged the very lives of our tenant farmers. When I took the title, I inherited a corpse." Gabriel's voice broke slightly, and he looked away ashamed. "When I signed that marriage contract with your father, I sold my pride to buy Oakhaven's survival. I hated myself for it, and I projected that hatred onto you. Every time I looked at you, I saw my own failure. I thought keeping you at a distance would somehow preserve what little dignity I had left. But watching my mother try to break your spirit today, hearing her call you a transaction..." He took a sharp breath, his jaw tightening. "It made me realize that the only person devoid of honor in this marriage was me." A profound silence settled over the room. Leora absorbed his words, seeing for the first time the crushing weight of the centuries-old coronet he wore. He was not a cold monster. He was a drowning man. Slowly, Leora walked around the desk. She did not offer him a platitude or a weeping embrace. Instead, she reached into the deep pocket of her modest lavender gown and pulled out a small brass key. She unlocked the bottom drawer of his desk, a drawer she had quietly commandeered weeks ago, and pulled out a thick stack of her own meticulously drafted blueprints and financial charts. "If we are to speak of honor, your grace, then let us speak of partnerships." Leora said, her voice steady and clear. She spread the papers over his scattered bills. "I am Thomas Hastings's daughter. I was raised on the scent of coal and the rhythm of steel. I did not come here to embroider cushions." Gabriel frowned, stepping closer to peer at the documents. "What are these?" This, Leora pointed to a hand-drawn map of the estate, is a proposal for a private 3-mile railway spur connecting Oakhaven's eastern timber forests directly to the Great Northern Railway line. The current method of hauling timber by horse-drawn carts to the river is costing you 40% of your potential profit in transport delays and middlemen fees. Gabriel stared at the map, stunned. He looked from the perfectly calculated gradients to Leora's face. She didn't stop. She pulled out another sheet. "And here is a cost analysis of replacing the manual threshing in the lower valley with 3 steam-powered threshers from Ransom Sims and Jeffries. The initial capital outlay, which I have already secured through a private draft from my father's Birmingham accounts, entirely separate from my dowry, will pay for itself in exactly 2 harvests. It will triple the yield and require the farmers to perform less manual labor, giving them time to cultivate secondary cash crops." Gabriel was utterly speechless. He traced the impeccably neat handwriting, the complex algebraic equations predicting crop yields, and the bold visionary sweep of the railway spur. He had spent months agonizing over pennies, trying to save a feudal system that was already dead. Leora, in a matter of weeks, had devised a blueprint to drag Oakhaven into the industrial age. You drafted this?" He whispered, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and profound awe. "While my mother was locking you out of the pantries, you were redesigning the entire economic foundation of a 600-year-old estate. A cart horse pulls the plough, Leora said softly, repeating her words from the drawing room. She looked up into his eyes, no longer afraid, no longer a stranger. You are my husband, Gabriel. Your burdens are my burdens. Let me help you carry them. Gabriel didn't say a word. He reached out his gloved hands, gently framing her face. The agonizing distance between them vanished in an instant. He leaned down and kissed her. It was not the brief, sterile peck of their wedding day. It was a kiss of profound desperation, of overwhelming gratitude, and of an undeniable, sudden, and terrifying passion. When he finally pulled away, his forehead rested against hers. I do not deserve you, Leora. He breathed, his thumbs tracing her cheekbones. But I swear to God, I will spend the rest of my life trying to. The Dowager Duchess did not take her public humiliation lightly. As Leora and Gabriel forged a formidable new alliance behind the closed doors of the study, Rachel retreated to her chambers in the West Wing, plotting her retribution. She was a creature of the old world, and she would rather see Oakhaven burn to the ground than see it saved by the daughter of a railway tycoon. Rachel knew that direct confrontation was no longer viable. Gabriel's furious defense of Leora had made that clear. She needed a proxy. She sent a discreetly coded telegram to Lord Richard Fitzroy in London. Fitzroy was a ruthless aristocratic venture capitalist, the very man who held several of the late Duke's most crippling promissory notes. Rachel offered him a devil's bargain if he could ensure Leora's industrial projects failed disastrously. She would use her influence among the Conservative board of local magistrates to force Gabriel to sell the Lower Valley lands to Fitzroy for a fraction of their worth. 2 weeks later, the steam threshers arrived from Birmingham. They were magnificent, terrifying beasts of iron and brass, gleaming under the weak Yorkshire sun. Leora and Gabriel stood side by side in the courtyard, watching as the massive machines were unloaded. For the first time since she arrived, Leora saw Gabriel smile, a genuine boyish grin that made him devastatingly handsome. However, the mood in the village was toxic. Rachel's lady's maid had been busy spreading poison among the tenant farmers. Whispers turned into mutters, and mutters turned into open hostility. The villagers were told that the ironmonger's daughter viewed them as expendable, that the steam machines were brought in to replace human hands, and that come winter, half the valley would be evicted to make way for the new railway spur. Leora noticed the change immediately. When she rode through the village with Gabriel, the women turned their backs. The men refused to tip their hats, their eyes hard and suspicious. They are afraid, Leora told Gabriel one evening in the library, poring over the deployment schedule for the machines. We are changing everything they have known for generations. We must speak to them, assure them that their tenancies are secure. I will summon the village elders tomorrow, Gabriel agreed, rubbing his tired eyes. He reached across the table, taking her hand and kissing her knuckles. We will show them the new contracts. Higher wages, better housing. They just need to see the proof. But they would never get the chance to show them the contracts. That night, a violent storm lashed against the stone walls of Oakhaven. Thunder shook the ancient foundations, masking the sound of footsteps creeping toward the main agricultural barns in the lower valley, where the new threshing machines were housed, along with the estate's entire winter supply of dry hay. At 3 a.m, Leora was jolted violently awake by the frantic ringing of the estate's alarm bell. She sat up, her heart leaping into her throat. Gabriel was already out of bed, throwing on his trousers and a heavy wool coat over his nightshirt. What is it? Leora cried, scrambling out of the tangled sheets. Fire. Gabriel shouted, his face pale in the dim candlelight. He looked out the massive bay window. In the distance, against the pitch-black sky, a massive pillar of orange flame roared into the night, illuminating the rain-slicked hills. It's the main barns, Leora. The threshers. The livestock. Leora didn't hesitate. She threw on a riding habit, forgoing the corset, and heavy petticoats shoved her feet into a pair of sturdy boots and ran after her husband. By the time they reached the lower valley, the scene was absolute pandemonium. The massive wooden barn was a towering inferno, the flames roaring with a deafening, monstrous sound, fueled by the dry hay and the fierce wind. The heat was unbearable, pushing back the crowd of panicked tenant farmers who had rushed from their cottages. The horses! A man screamed over the roar of the fire. The draft horses are still in the stables attached to the back, Gabriel didn't think. He grabbed a heavy woolen horse blanket from a bystander, dunked it into a nearby water trough, and threw it over his head. Gabriel, no, Leora screamed, grabbing his arm. The roof of the barn was already groaning, the massive oak beams cracking under the intense heat. I cannot let them burn, Leora. He yelled back, his eyes wild. He kissed her hard on the mouth, a desperate, terrifying goodbye, and plunged into the smoke-filled stables. Panic seized Leora's chest in an icy grip, but she forced it down. This was not the time to be a weeping aristocrat. She was Thomas Hastings' daughter. She spun around and faced the disorganized, terrified crowd of villagers. Listen to me, she screamed, her voice cutting through the chaos with the same commanding force her father used on the factory floors. The villagers, stunned by the sight of the Duchess covered in soot and commanding them in the dead of night, froze. Form a line from the river, Leora ordered, pointing to the nearby River Ouse. Women and older children fetch every bucket, every pot, every canvas sack you have. Men grab axes and tear down the wooden fencing connecting the main barn to the grain silos. We must create a firebreak or the whole valley will starve this winter. Her absolute authority snapped the villagers out of their panic. They scrambled to obey. Leora grabbed a bucket herself, standing knee-deep in the freezing, rushing water of the river, passing heavy buckets of water up the line, her arms burning, her face smeared with ash. Heave! Leora shouted, her voice hoarse, rallying the men tearing at the fences. Pull it down! Suddenly, a massive, sickening crack echoed through the night. The main roof of the barn collapsed inward, sending a spectacular, terrifying shower of sparks into the dark sky. Leora dropped her bucket, her blood running cold. Gabriel! She screamed, her voice tearing. For a horrifying 10 seconds, nothing emerged from the billowing black smoke of the adjacent stables. And then a massive Shire horse burst through the smoke, whinnying in terror, followed by another and another. Finally, Gabriel stumbled out, leading the last terrified foal. His coat was scorched, his face black with soot, and he was coughing violently, but he was alive. Leora broke from the bucket line and ran to him, throwing her arms around his neck, burying her face in his smoky wet coat, not caring who saw. Gabriel dropped the lead rope and wrapped his arms around her, tightly burying his face in her hair. As the rain finally began to fall in heavy driving sheets, helping to douse the remaining flames, the exhausted villagers gathered around the ruined barn. The 3 expensive steam threshers were nothing but twisted, blackened metal. Fitzroy's saboteurs had done their job well. The financial blow was catastrophic. But as the villagers looked at their duke covered in burns and soot, having risked his life for their animals, and their new Duchess standing knee-deep in freezing mud, her hands blistered from the bucket line, a profound shift occurred. The poison Rachel had spread washed away with the rain. The head of the village elders, an old man named Higgins, stepped forward, removing his flat cap. He looked at the ruined machines, then at Leora. We lost the iron beasts. Your Grace. Higgins said, his voice rough with smoke and newly found respect. But you saved the grain, and you saved the horses. You tell us what needs doing tomorrow, and every man in this valley will stand behind you. Leora looked at Gabriel, gripping his hand tightly. They had lost the battle, but as the dawn broke over the smoking ruins of Oakhaven, they knew they had just won the war for the valley's soul. Now they just had to find out who had struck the match. The morning sun cast a sickly, pallid light over the smouldering ruins of the lower valley barns. The stench of damp ash, charred timber, and roasted grain clung to the heavy Yorkshire mist. Leora stood beside Gabriel, the hem of her muddy riding skirt brushing against the blackened bones of her steam threshers. They were supposed to be the salvation of Oakhaven. Now they were simply twisted monuments to a devastating sabotage. Gabriel knelt in the soot, running a blistered hand over the warped brass plating of what had once been the main boiler of a Ransom's thresher. His jaw was set so tightly that a muscle ticked frantically beneath his soot-stained cheek. This was no accident of a dropped lantern, Gabriel rasped, his voice still hoarse from the smoke. The fire started in 3 distinct locations simultaneously: the hayloft, the stables, and the machinery shed. It was a coordinated attack. But who would orchestrate such a thing? Leora asked, wrapping her shawl tighter against the morning chill. The villagers were hesitant, yes, but they are not arsonists. They depend on that grain as much as we do. Their answer came in the form of old Mr. Higgins, the village elder, who trudged through the muck holding something wrapped in a scorched linen cloth. He approached the Duke and Duchess with a grim expression, pulling back the cloth to reveal a heavy dented brass canister. It smelled strongly of refined kerosene. Found this tossed in the River Reeds about half a mile down your grace. Higgins reported spitting a wad of tobacco into the mud. We don't use this kind of oil for our lamps. Too expensive. And look at the maker's mark. Gabriel took the canister, turning it over to inspect the bottom. Leora leaned in, her sharp eyes catching the elegant stamped insignia W & Co. Regent Street, London. This was brought here from the city. Leora murmured, her analytical mind immediately piecing the fragments together. Someone hired professionals, men who knew exactly how to destroy an industrial machine without blowing themselves to pieces. Gabriel's eyes darkened like a storm front. Lord Richard Fitzroy. The name tasted like poison. Fitzroy held the largest portion of the late Duke's gambling debts. He had been lobbying for years to force Gabriel into bankruptcy, so he could seize the Lower Valley Stripit of its fertile topsoil and mine the lucrative coal seams hidden deep beneath the Oakhaven estate. But Fitzroy was in London 300 miles away. To execute a precise strike on the exact night the machines were most vulnerable, he would have needed an inside informant. Leora immediately returned to her chambers and drafted a coded telegram to her father in Birmingham. Thomas Hastings was not merely a wealthy man. He was a titan of industry who possessed an intelligence network that rivaled Scotland Yard's. He employed dozens of former military men to protect his railway shipments from saboteurs and thieves. Within 48 hours, a discreet, unsmiling gentleman named Mr. Henry Carmichael arrived at Oakhaven on a midnight train. Carmichael was Thomas Hastings' chief fixer. Operating out of a small, nondescript room in the local village inn, Carmichael traced the kerosene canister to a notorious gang of Dockland thugs in London known to be on Fitzroy's payroll. But the truly devastating piece of evidence came from the local telegraph office in York. Carmichael bribed a junior telegraph operator and returned to Oakhaven under the cover of darkness, presenting a transcribed copy of a telegram sent just 3 days prior to the fire. Leora and Gabriel sat by the hearth in Gabriel's private study as Carmichael handed over the slip of paper. The message was sent to Lord Fitzroy's private club in St. James's. Carmichael stated flatly, his hands clasped behind his back. It was sent under a pseudonym, but the telegraph operator confirmed the sender was a woman draped in heavy mourning black, arriving in a carriage bearing the Somerset crest. Gabriel's blood ran cold. His hands trembled as he unfolded the telegraph paper. The message read, "The iron beasts are penned. The commoner's gold is vulnerable. Send the butchers before the harvest." Leora watched as the colour completely drained from her husband's face. The paper slipped from his fingers, fluttering to the Persian rug like a dying moth. He stared into the fireplace, the flames reflecting in eyes that had suddenly gone completely hollow. "My own mother!" Gabriel whispered the words, tearing from his throat. The betrayal was absolute, staggering in its cruelty. She would rather burn 600 years of our family's legacy to ash. She would rather let our people freeze and starve than see me succeed with you. Leora moved to his side, kneeling beside his chair and taking his cold hands in hers. She felt a fierce, protective rage rising in her chest. Rachel had crossed the line from a bitter, snobbish dowager to a treasonous criminal. "Gabriel," Leora said softly, her voice steady and commanding, anchoring him to reality. "She wanted to break you. She wanted to prove that my presence here would only bring destruction. We cannot let her win." Gabriel slowly turned his head to look at her. The grief in his eyes was rapidly crystallizing into a terrifying glacial fury. The remnants of his filial piety burned away, leaving only the ruthless pragmatism of a duke defending his realm. "No," Gabriel said, his voice deadly quiet. "We will not let her win. When does Fitzroy arrive to claim his spoils?" "If he follows the pattern of a predatory lender," Carmichael interjected smoothly, He will arrive tomorrow to assess the accidental damage and demand immediate payment on his promissory notes, knowing you cannot pay. Gabriel stood up, his towering frame casting a long, ominous shadow across the study walls. Then we shall prepare a proper Yorkshire welcome for the Lord, and my mother will have a front-row seat to her own destruction. The following afternoon, the skies above Oak Haven cleared, but the atmosphere inside the Grand Manor was suffocatingly tense. The Dowager Duchess Rachel sat in the main drawing room, wearing her most opulent black silk morning gown, a smug, imperious smile playing on her lips as she sipped her Darjeeling tea. At exactly 2 o'clock, a luxurious black carriage bearing the crest of a London earl crunched up the gravel driveway. Lord Richard Fitzroy had arrived. He was a slender, sharp-featured man with oiled hair and the oily charm of a snake oil salesman, accompanied by Sir Edwin Croft, a corrupt local magistrate who was deeply in Fitzroy's pocket. Rachel rose to greet them, feigning a tragic sigh. Lord Fitzroy, Sir Edwin, a terrible tragedy has befallen us. The Lower Valley barns, destroyed by the reckless industrial folly of my son's new wife. Fitzroy offered a predatory sympathetic bow. A devastating blow, Your Grace. I came as soon as I heard the news. As a friend of the family, and as your chief creditor, I felt it my duty to offer a solution to this dreadful financial crisis. Before Rachel could reply, the heavy double doors of the drawing room swung open. Gabriel strode in, looking every inch the Duke of Somerset. He wore a sharply tailored charcoal suit, his posture rigid, his face an impenetrable mask. Leora walked beside him, a vision of quiet, lethal elegance, in a deep navy gown, completely devoid of the intimidation she had shown during Rachel's tea party weeks prior. Lord Fitzroy, Gabriel said coldly, not offering his hand. You are trespassing. I did not invite you to Oakhaven. Fitzroy sneered, pulling a thick stack of legal documents from his leather briefcase. With respect, Your Grace, I do not need an invitation. The terms of your late father's loans dictate that upon any catastrophic loss of estate collateral, the debt may be called in immediately. The fire has ruined your harvest collateral. You owe me £80,000 payable today. Since we both know you do not have it, Sir Edwin is here to legally transfer the deeds of the Lower Valley to my name. Rachel stepped forward, pressing a laced handkerchief to her dry eyes. Gabriel, you must be reasonable. Leora's foolish machines have doomed us. Sign the valley over to Lord Fitzroy. It is the only honourable way to save the rest of Oakhaven. Gabriel looked at his mother. The silence in the room stretched until it felt like a physical weight. Honourable. Gabriel repeated the word, dripping with venom. He reached into his breast pocket and withdrew the transcribed telegram, tossing it onto the low table between them. Is this your definition of honour? Mother hiring London street thugs to burn our winter survival so you could force a sale? Rachel's eyes snapped to the paper. Her smug facade shattered instantly, her face draining of all colour. I don't know what that is. It is a forgery. A lie concocted by this commoner to turn you against me, she shrieked, pointing a trembling jewelled finger at Leora. The telegraph operator at York confessed, Your Grace. Leora said evenly, her voice cutting through Rachel's hysterics. Mr. Carmichael is quite persuasive. Fitzroy, realizing his co-conspirator had been caught, quickly adjusted his strategy. He puffed out his chest, stepping forward. Regardless of how the fire started, the debt remains Somerset. You cannot pay. The law is the law. Sign the deeds, or Sir Edwin will issue a warrant for the seizure of the entire estate. I believe, a booming, gravelly voice echoed from the doorway. There seems to be a misunderstanding regarding who holds the debt. Everyone spun around. Standing in the doorway was a man who seemed to take up all the oxygen in the room. Thomas Hastings was built like a brick foundry, with a thick silver beard, a tailored but unpretentious tweed suit, and eyes that held the ruthless intelligence of a self-made empire builder. He walked into the drawing room, completely ignoring the aristocracy, and walked straight to his daughter, kissing her warmly on the cheek. You look well, Leora, my dear, Thomas rumbled. He then turned to Gabriel, offering a firm nod. Your Grace, I received Leora's telegram. I brought the carriage as quickly as the rail lines would allow. Fitzroy scoffed, recovering his arrogance. Ah, the ironmonger arrives to witness the fall. Mr. Hastings, your daughter's dowry is already spent. You cannot simply write a cheque to stop a legal foreclosure. I am well aware of the law, Lord Fitzroy, Thomas said, pulling a long-bound leather ledger from under his arm. He tossed it onto the table next to the telegram. It landed with a heavy, definitive thud. Which is why I did not write a cheque to my son-in-law. I wrote one to the Bank of England. Fitzroy's oily smile faltered. What are you talking about? Thomas Hastings clasped his hands behind his back, looking at Fitzroy with the terrifying calm of a predator who had just trapped its prey. Your own finances are heavily leveraged, Lord Fitzroy. You borrowed extensively from the London mercantile banks to fund your little venture capital schemes. Once I received word of your attack on my daughter's estate, I took a train to London. I purchased every single one of your outstanding promissory notes debts and mortgages from the banks at a premium. Fitzroy physically staggered back, his face turning an ashen grey. You couldn't have... I own you, Fitzroy. Thomas stated, his voice devoid of any emotion. Every brick of your London townhouse, every horse in your stables, and the very clothes on your back. And as your primary creditor, I am calling in your debts. Immediately. If you do not leave this estate in 10 seconds, I will have my lawyers seize your assets before the sun sets, and you will be in a debtor's prison by morning. Fitzroy opened his mouth to argue, but the sheer crushing reality of Hastings' financial power silenced him. He looked at Sir Edwin Croft, who was already inching toward the door, wanting no part in this slaughter. Trembling with rage and terror, Fitzroy snatched up his briefcase and fled the room without a single word. The drawing room fell dead silent once more, save for the ticking of the grand clock. Gabriel turned his attention back to his mother. Rachel was gripping the back of a chair, trembling violently, completely stripped of her power, her allies, and her dignity. You are no longer the Dowager Duchess of Oakhaven, Gabriel pronounced, his voice a cold, immovable stone. You will pack your belongings by nightfall. You are being permanently relocated to the Dower House in the Scottish Highlands. You will receive a minimal stipend, and you will never set foot on this estate again. Gabriel, you cannot. Rachel wept, finally breaking, dropping to her knees. I am your mother. I did this for the bloodline. You did this for your own vanity, Gabriel corrected harshly. He stepped back, standing shoulder to shoulder with Leora, taking her hand in a grip of iron. You told Leora she was bought, not chosen. You were wrong. I chose her. And today I choose my wife over you. The departure of the Dowager Duchess was a stark, silent affair. No servants lined the driveway to bid her farewell. Rachel Pendleton stepped into the unadorned black carriage as a freezing Yorkshire rain began to fall her face, hidden beneath a heavy veil. She did not look back at the towering stone facade of Oakhaven, nor did Gabriel step out onto the terrace to watch her leave. The umbilical cord to the toxic past had been severed. For the next 6 months, Oakhaven was reborn from its own ashes. With Thomas Hastings' financial backing and Leora's brilliant architectural restructuring, the lower valley transformed. The charred remains of the old barns were replaced with modern fire-resistant structures of brick and Birmingham steel. The private railway spur, christened the Somerset Line, was completed ahead of schedule, carving a vital economic artery through the forests directly to the Great Northern Railway. Gabriel and Leora worked side by side, shedding the suffocating formalities of their class. The Duke of Somerset could often be found with his sleeves rolled up, inspecting timber shipments alongside his foreman, Mr. Higgins. Leora, no longer confined to the drawing room, managed the sprawling estate's logistics from her husband's study, her fingers often stained with the same ink that stained his. The cold, forced transaction of their marriage had blossomed into an unbreakable partnership, fueled by deep mutual respect and a passionate, overwhelming love. However, a wounded viper is often the most dangerous. Rachel, festering in the damp isolation of the Scottish Highlands, found one final desperate avenue for her vengeance. Stripped of her wealth and influence, she turned to the darkest corners of London's press. On a crisp Tuesday in November, the Pall Mall Gazette, a broadsheet notorious for its ruthless political exposés, ran a front-page headline that sent shockwaves through the British Empire The iron dowry, how the Hastings fortune bought a dukedom with stolen crown lands. Gabriel burst into the study that morning, his face ashen, clutching the newspaper. Leora looked up from her ledger, sensing the immediate shift in the air. "What is it?" she asked, her pulse quickening. Gabriel spread the paper on the mahogany desk. "It is my mother's doing. She has conspired with Lord Harrington, a political rival of mine in the House of Lords. They have forged documents claiming that your father bribed parliamentary surveyors to lay his Midland rail lines across protected Crown territories. The article claims your entire dowry is illicit and that by accepting it, I have made the Somerset estate an accessory to treason against the Crown." Leora's eyes scanned the vicious, sensationalized prose. The allegations were meticulously detailed, referencing real parliamentary acts from 1882 and utilizing forged signatures of deceased surveyors. "If the public believes this," Leora whispered, the gravity of the situation sinking in, "the Prime Minister will be forced to launch an inquiry. My father's company's stocks will plummet. His empire could collapse. And the House of Lords will strip me of my seat, perhaps even attain my title," Gabriel finished grimly. He slammed his fist onto the desk, rattling the inkwells. "She knows she cannot destroy us financially anymore, so she seeks to destroy our names. To make the name Hastings synonymous with treason and Somerset synonymous with disgrace." Leora stood up, her father's iron will straightening her spine. "We did not rebuild this estate from ashes just to let a newspaper tear it down. We are going to London, Gabriel." 2 days later, the Duke and Duchess of Somerset arrived in Mayfair. The atmosphere in high society was electric with anticipation of their downfall. Invitations that had once flowed freely were suddenly lost in the post. As they walked through the grand lobby of the Savoy Hotel, the whispers followed them like a swarm of locusts. Thomas Hastings met them in their private suite, his face uncharacteristically drawn. "Harrington has called for a special parliamentary committee," Thomas rumbled, pacing the floor. "He is demanding I turn over 20 years of private company ledgers. It is a witch hunt. Even if we prove the documents are forged, the scandal alone will cost thousands of jobs in my factories." Leora looked out the window at the fog-choked streets of London. She knew that defending themselves with lawyers and ledgers would take months, during which the poison would continue to spread. They needed a public, undeniable victory. They needed the ultimate endorsement. "When is the Duke of Devonshire's winter ball?" Leora asked, suddenly turning back to the room. Gabriel blinked, caught off guard. "Tomorrow evening. It is the pinnacle of the social season. But Leora, we cannot attend. Half the peerage will cut us dead. Harrington will be there gloating." "Exactly," Leora said, her eyes flashing with a brilliant, dangerous light. "Let him gloat. Let them all gather in one room to watch our execution. Because we are not going there to defend ourselves, Gabriel. We are going there to trap a rat." Devonshire House was a magnificent, glittering palace of excess. 1,000 wax candles cast a golden hue over the marble floors, illuminating the velvet coats and diamond tiaras of Britain's most elite families. Prime Minister Robert Gascoigne Cecil, Lord Salisbury, was in attendance along with a heavy contingent of the royal family, including Albert Edward, the Prince of Wales. When the majordomo struck his staff against the marble floor and announced, "Their Graces the Duke and Duchess of Somerset," the string orchestra seemed to abruptly lose its tempo. Silence rippled through the grand ballroom. Hundreds of eyes turned toward the grand staircase. Gabriel descended the stairs looking like a god of war in formal evening dress, his chest adorned with the ancient jeweled orders of his ancestors. But it was Leora who stole the breath from the room. She wore a gown of midnight blue velvet so dark it looked almost black, masterfully tailored to her silhouette. But instead of wearing the ancient heavy Somerset diamonds, Leora wore a bespoke necklace and tiara forged from polished Birmingham steel and encrusted with raw, uncut sapphires. It was a defiant, breathtaking tribute to her industrial heritage. They moved through the crowd, parting the sea of aristocrats. Lord Harrington, a balding, pompous earl, with a fiercely aristocratic pedigree, sneered as they approached. "Somerset," Harrington said loudly, ensuring the surrounding crowd, including the Prime Minister, could hear. "I am surprised you have the audacity to show your face in polite society. I would have thought you'd be too busy hiding your father-in-law's forged deeds. Gabriel stopped looking down at Harrington, with a gaze so chilling, the older man visibly recoiled. I hide nothing, Harrington. Unlike those who hide behind the skirts of an exiled dowager to orchestrate a smear campaign. Gasps echoed through the immediate circle. Harrington's face flushed purple. How dare you? The Pall Mall Gazette has exposed your treason. The Crown lands were violated. Your wealth is dirt. The only dirt here is what you have shoveled to cover your own bankruptcy. Leora's voice cut through the tension clear as a silver bell. She stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with her husband. She turned to face the Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury, who was watching the exchange with intense, eagle-eyed scrutiny. Lord Salisbury, if I may. The Prime Minister nodded slowly. You may, Your Grace. Leora signalled to Mr. Carmichael, who had discreetly blended into the shadows near the entrance. He stepped forward, handing Leora a red leather dispatch box. Lord Harrington claims my father stole Crown lands in 1882 to build the Midland Line, Leora announced to the captivated ballroom. What Lord Harrington failed to realise when he purchased forged documents from my vengeful mother-in-law is that the Midland Line was never a private venture. She opened the box and pulled out a heavy parchment sealed with the royal coat of arms. This, Leora declared, her voice ringing with absolute triumph, is a classified charter from the War Office signed by Her Majesty Queen Victoria in 1881. The lands were legally leased to Thomas Hastings under the Official Secrets Act to build a covert military transport line in the event of a continental threat, a project my father funded at cost saving the Crown millions. The ballroom erupted into shocked murmurs. Harrington's jaw dropped, his face draining of blood. You did not expose a corporate theft, Lord Harrington. Gabriel added, his voice a lethal strike. You attempted to expose a classified military secret for political gain. I believe the War Office calls that high treason. Brilliant, a jovial, booming voice interrupted. The crowd instantly parted, bowing and curtsying deeply as Albert Edward, the Prince of Wales, stepped forward. The prince looked at the trembling Lord Harrington with sheer disgust. Harrington, you are an absolute fool. Remove yourself from this house before I have my guards drag you out. Harrington practically stumbled over his own feet as he fled the ballroom, his reputation and political career utterly annihilated in less than 3 minutes. The prince then turned to Gabriel and Leora, his eyes twinkling with admiration. He bowed his head slightly to Leora, a rare and staggering honour. Your Grace, that steel tiara is the most magnificent thing I have seen this season. It seems the Duke of Somerset has not only secured his estate, but has married the sharpest mind in the empire. I am inclined to agree, Your Highness, Gabriel said, looking at Leora with such profound, unshielded devotion that several of the gossiping countesses nearby felt a pang of genuine envy. The orchestra resumed the tension, breaking into a flurry of excited, admiring whispers. The social execution had become a coronation. The Hastings-Pendleton alliance was now untouchable. Later that evening, Gabriel and Leora escaped the suffocating heat of the ballroom, retreating to one of the quiet moonlit balconies overlooking the sprawling gardens of Devonshire House. The fog had lifted, revealing a canopy of brilliant stars. Gabriel wrapped his heavy coat around Leora's shoulders to ward off the chill. He pulled her close, resting his chin on the top of her head. My mother told you in that drawing room that you were bought, not chosen. Gabriel murmured softly, the memory of that terrible day feeling like a lifetime ago. He gently turned her to face him, his hands cupping her face. She was a fool, Leora. From the moment you unlocked my desk and showed me how to save my world, I have chosen you every single day. You did not buy a dukedom. You saved a man. Leora smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek, glittering like the sapphires in her hair. And you, Your Grace, have proven to be an excellent investment. Gabriel laughed, a rich, joyous sound that echoed into the London night, before pulling her into a deep, consuming kiss. The ledgers were balanced, the enemies were vanquished, and Oakhaven thrived, standing as a monumental testament to a truth that high society would never truly understand. The greatest fortunes in the world were not inherited by blood, but forged in the fires of a true and equal partnership. What a journey Leora and Gabriel proved that true power doesn't come from an ancient title or a mountain of gold, but from courage, loyalty, and an unbreakable partnership that defies the odds. If you were captivated by Leora's brilliant revenge and Gabriel's fierce devotion, don't keep this story to yourself. Like this video, share it with friends who love a highly dramatic historical romance, and make sure to subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, real-life inspired tales of love, betrayal, and ultimate triumph. Drop a comment below. Would you have forgiven the Duke or walked away? Let us know.